Got it? We're going. Yay. All right. So for purposes of the recording, I will say that we're going to talk about the structure of the commandments, why they are written the way they are, and why they are in the book of Exodus at the point where they are, and what difference that makes to us as we read them. One of the things we talked about last week is when we look at, particularly in the Old Testament, which is a giant conversation between a lot of different voices. We need to look at a passage both within how it functions within the book, and then if it's in the Torah or the Pentateuch, which is the most sacred of the Jewish texts, we need to look and see how the text is conversing with other related texts in the Torah, right? Which is Genesis to Deuteronomy. In the Christian world, we generally call it the Pentateuch, right? But it's the same text. And so we'll do some of this today because it's important, right? For understanding the function of the commandments. More widely than that, we look across the Hebrew Bible. So Genesis to the very end, right, of the prophets. And keep in mind, we did some work on this last week. We'll continue to mention it each week. But in the Old Testament, there is a general storyline, right, which starts at the beginning. And the story actually ends at the return from exile, right? But the order in which we read the texts and the way they're positioned in our Bible is not the order in which they were written. We have to keep that in mind, because the texts were most likely compiled in the form that we have it today, most likely in the post-exilic period, which would have been under the Persian Empire, which made the conditions favorable in their colonies, of which Yehud or Judah was one, to write histories, to write their laws, to compile their texts. This was a feature of the Persian Empire that made it possible for the people in their colonies to take all of their writings and put them together, right? That it's also important to realize that, not so much for what we're going to talk about today, but for some of the later classes that we'll have. That's also important because law features very prominently in the Persian era. Why is that? Because one of the things that Persia did with their colonies was to collect the legal material that had accumulated in places like Mesopotamia or Yehud, Egypt, other lesser empires around, and they would pull all of those in and then see, one, do our colonies know how to keep order? And two, what can we put into our law codes from their law codes, right? I mean, it was just kind of a thing that they did. So anyway, we have to look really across the Hebrew Bible, and today, one of the things that's an important conversation that we'll mention is the Psalms, because you could actually use the Psalms to teach the entire history of Israel, because it's all there, right? Again, not in order, but if you were to take the Psalms and you were to put them on a timeline, right? Because attribution is made to David for a large part of the Psalms, but there's also attribution made to other writers. But if you took the Psalms and you reordered them, you could actually pretty much teach everything right from the Psalms, because it's all there. So we're going to look at that today. And then, of course, the New Testament, right? We find the Ten Commandments several places in the New Testament. When Jesus encounters the rich young ruler, the commandments, we have a list there. We also have a list, Paul makes reference to them. So they were widely known and used, right? So we have to kind of look at all of that. We're not going to do it all at once, but over the course of the course, we'll look at each of these pieces. So today, one of the important contexts that we want to look at is, where are the commandments given? And if you look at the story, if you look at the book of Exodus as a whole, 40 chapters, it's divided into two parts. The first 20 is the story of the Exodus, right? 20 to 24, to the end, are the legal sections, which has the 10 Commandments, the Book of the Covenant, the building of the tabernacle, and then inserted into the middle of this very long legal section is this crazy story about a golden calf, right? And we're going to talk about that some today, but going forward. And that becomes a significant thing that we'll talk about today also. But right before, as the community of Israel approaches Sinai, God calls Moses aside and says, I want you to tell the Israelites something. I want you to tell them that you've seen what I did in Egypt, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be three things: treasured possession, a priestly kingdom, and a holy nation. Right? These are the words you shall speak to the Israelites. Right? This is important because we have to look at what's happening to the people. This mass number of people have been taken out of Egypt by God's hands, according to the story, right? And you've got this whole bunch of people that God intends to do something with. Well, what is that? Well, God has an intention to make this people into a people that have these three characteristics. They're treasured by God, but it's a priestly kingdom, right? And a holy nation, right? That's what God wants to form. The next thing we have after this are the 10 words, the 10 commandments, right? So if we're wondering, what is it that God's up to once delivered, then what? Well, the then what, or the so what, is God wants to make them into a new kind of people. How's that going to happen? Well, they have to have some kind of structure, right, for this to be the case. Before they can, so let me ask a question. What is this priestly kingdom thing? What does a priest do? Just in general, priests do what? In any context. Yeah, that's the person in between God and humans, right? So that's Israel's supposed to function on the international stage, right, in God's mind, like that. They have a person who's doing that role in the book of Exodus, right? And who is that mediator? Moses, right? And for a brief period, when Moses is somewhere on that mountain, Aaron takes over. We all know how that turned out, but Moses is the mediator. But the idea is for the people to become the mediator. So how's that going to happen? Well, there has to be some kind of structure that will allow that to happen. And the 10 Commandments come in that context, right? A holy nation, and we'll deal with this in a lot of detail when we talk about the Sabbath, but the word holy comes from a Hebrew root, which means to separate, right? And this is super important for the logic of law, is that everything has to have a place, right? If you're holy, then you're separate from something else, and you know what the place is, right? Hence, Genesis 1, right? Which is most likely a legally constructed text, because creation is described in Genesis 1 as very ordered. everything is made for a purpose and everybody knows where you're supposed to be, right? What the law does is it creates a boundary so that you know what's in, what's out, right? So when we're reading the Ten Commandments, we have to see that these are boundary creating types of sayings and rules. Hence, the you shall have no, you shall not, you shall not. These are all marking a boundary, right? But they do even more than that. And this is what I want us to talk about today. These boundaries mark what we call liminal spaces, right? And a liminal space is just a word for a boundary, right? The boundaries are places of transition, they're places of in between, and therefore they are places of risk, and they are places of uncertainty and vulnerability, right? Because when you're in a space and there's a line, there's safety on one side and there's something else on the other, right? Or there's something that's known on one side, something that's unknown on another, right? It marks two different kinds of things, right? And so when you're at a boundary, you're at a place of transition. You're crossing something or not, right? You're at a place where you can go over the line, or a place where you go up to it, or there's a place where don't go there. Because what's on the other side is something you need to be careful of, right? So let's talk a little bit about these liminal spaces. And again, liminal just means a boundary, place of transition. They could be physical, emotional, ideological, spiritual. There's many more things. We're going to work with these three today, right? A physical boundary is most easily understood as a door. That door right there. All you have to do is look at it, and you know that when you leave this place, you're going somewhere else. There's not tables and chairs out there, except for picnics, right? But this is a different space, right, than that space out there. When you cross the door, you experience something different, right? That's why that door is there. Another, I think even a better place of getting the breadth of liminality is your skin. Right? This separates you from the world, right? So when you puncture yourself, what happens? You bleed, which is something inside of you going outside. What's inside of you coming outside is not supposed to happen. You know something's wrong, right? What's the marker where something is wrong when you cut yourself? Pain. Right? Liminal space, these boundaries often have some kind of pain associated with it, right? You want to do everything you can to keep yourself from being hurt. You don't want your body fluids coming out. I mean, sometimes it happens, right? But in the logic of Hebrew law, and I'm going to say it this way because this is the way they understood it. It may not be the way we understand it, but the way they understood it is that everything that's in your body needs to stay in your body. If something in your body comes out, then it's not where it's supposed to be and is therefore unclean, right? Unclean doesn't mean sinful, right? It's a marker of something being not separated, unholy, right? And therefore it impairs the approach to the divine. Now that's not how we think, particularly, but if we understand this early in Israel's history, then it makes what Jesus comes to do for us later all the more astonishing. because Jesus takes care of all of this, right? But for Israel, now I want you to think story here. These are people, a mixed group, like we talked about last time, that are coming out of slavery. They don't know any of this, right? And so the commandments represent the first piece of structure for them. Their physicality is going to change. The boundaries, the relationships are going to change, right? And the thing we're going to see in the law, and particularly right here at Sinai, is that you've got something really boundary crossing that's happening. You have a holy God coming into a relationship with messy people. The holy is coming into contact with the unholy. Now, we kind of take this for granted because we're used to it. But what happens when the holy divine has to be in relationship with something that is not so ordered, right? That all happens in Exodus, and it's explosive, and it's dramatic, right? And so you've got a lot of shifting perspectives, right? In this liminal space, you've got a people coming out of Egypt, and let's talk about Egypt for a little while, right? What do you know about Egypt in that era?
Went into slavery.
The slavery, right? They were slaves. They had no rights.
Well, they're also polytheists.
Polytheists, gods everywhere, right?
As a matter of fact, Pharaoh was supposed to be a god.
Was supposed to be a god, right? Right? You had the pyramids, you had the sun god, you had gods for everything. You had all of that. What else did you have in Egypt? I mean, let's unpack the slavery. If you're a slave, right, what's your life like?
Not your own, had to demand it.
It's not your own. You work all the time.
Right.
There's no break. Right. And so when you've got something like a Sabbath, right, which is a day of stopping, this is very anti-Egypt, right? The commandments are going to be a boundary marker. It's not just law, it's actually it's creating a picture of what is not Egypt. Right? It's something completely different. But how would you understand that difference? Except that you mark the boundaries, right? Just what the law is doing.
The other thing in Egypt, wouldn't being a slave with different masters, you'd have inconsistency.
Absolutely,
Good
yes.
masters, bad masters, and you're changing from that to a consistent master.
Right, yes, exactly, right. All change everywhere, right? So let's talk about the liminal space. Genesis, now here's where we're going to do conversation, right? Between Exodus and Genesis. The very first story, and I think this is remarkable, right? The very first story, once humanity leaves the garden, is about what? Murder. Isn't that striking? I mean, if I were writing the story, I mean, as a playwright, you want the drama to come immediately, right? So dramatically, it's Genesis 4 is placed exactly where it should be, right? But it's still striking that the very first story you have about familial relationships is murder. I mean, I would have chosen it to be, you go out into this beautiful world that God has created and you have a good time, but that's not what we have. We have a story about work, labor, murder, right? Which talks to us in some way about the power of desire, right? Right off the bat. So in the story of Cain and Abel, in verse 6 and 7, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? Right? This is because God looked at Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, do you notice the liminality here? Sin is crouching at the door. The door is the place of transition. Right? Cain is at a place of transition. Right? Cain is at a place of having to figure out what to do, having brought his sacrifice and it not being regarded as favorable as Abel's. And in this particular situation, what God is saying to Cain is that you're at a very vulnerable place in your life. And you've got to reckon with that because there's something that's in front of you that you don't want to cross. Right? You with me so far? All right. And what is it? Sin. This is the first time, now this is always shocking to people, but this is the first time where the word sin is used in the Old Testament. It is not used in the garden story. Doesn't appear. So just little sidebar, because this is always interesting. The conventional wisdom of why did Adam and Eve leave the garden is what? Sin. But that's not what the text says. Genesis 3, 23, 22, and 23 says that they left the garden so that they would not eat of the tree of life and live forever. Right? There was something even worse in the garden, which was the possibility of living forever with the knowledge now that they had of good and evil. So the boundary of the Garden of Eden and the reason they left was actually protection from that. You don't, it's only in later, and this is where the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament gets really messy, right? Because the New Testament does a lot of interpreting of Old Testament texts for us. But in doing that, we have to hold what the New Testament is saying, but we also have to learn to read what the Old Testament is actually doing, right? It's talking to us about something a bit different, which is once you know the difference between good and evil, then what do you have to do?
You gotta choose.
You've got to choose. That's exactly right. You've got to become a responsible adult. Right. And this is what most of the Hebrew Bible, in terms of its Hebrewness, is doing for us. It's talking to us about being responsible human beings. Responsible human beings don't go around killing each other, for example, right? And so this first story about sin is lurking at the door means that there is something within us that we have to master, right? But what is that? Well, if we think in terms of liminality and Porter's, and we look at the Ten Commandments that way, we've got to learn how to honor each other, parents. We have to learn how to not go around killing people when we don't like them. We have to learn how to not steal or appropriate other people's property for our own use. We have to learn how to tell the truth. And we have to learn how to master desire. That's our job. It's the most difficult job in the world to be human and learn how to master this desire that we all have. Desire is not bad. And that's one thing I want to be sure everyone understands. There is no concept here that desire in of itself is bad. It's powerful and it has to be appropriated correctly. That's the notion. So
Sinless desire is bad.
is bad, right? But desire within us has to be mastered. We have to recognize this.
Has to be under control.
Has to be under control, right? We have to learn this. So Genesis gives us a perspective on this. What about Psalm 121? Very famous psalm. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. He will keep your what? Going out and coming in from this time on and forevermore. Liminality. God is at the transition point. We are never, I mean, this is a big statement. I'm sure I can be proven wrong. It just seems to me that we are at our most vulnerable when we are in points of transition. We're not there, we're not here, we're not there. We're in between. Something has happened and we're dislocated and we're looking for the new place. And that's where we seem to be very vulnerable to sin, right? The evil of sin. But if we look at the Psalms, how does the Psalm speak into that? Well, the Psalm says God is he will keep your going out and your coming in. God is at the door. God is at the boundary. That's good news, right? Now, the word that's used here, shamar, is the verb to keep, right? He will keep. Now, notice how it's used a bunch of times. This is a feature of Hebrew writing, right? It applies pretty much everywhere. If you see a word repeated, pay attention, because that's how it's emphasized. And here it's emphasized a whole bunch of times. Keep, keep, keep. This word keep is the same word, the same idea that's used in Cain's question to God. Am I my brother's keeper? What's my responsibility to be watching out for my brother in the going out and the coming in? Right? Liminal, the border, right? Now, in the Hebrew Bible, and this is going to apply to Sinai as well. Let me ask a question this way. How many of you have watched Godfather movie? 1, 2, or 3? Okay. You know from the Godfather movie that anytime somebody says, let's take a ride, somebody's going to die. Right? The same principle is true across the Hebrew Bible when you see a field of any kind. If anybody goes out into a field, somebody's going to die, right? Or a wilderness. Something's going to happen out there. It's a liminal space, right? It's a boundaryless space. And so when we talk about God's presence, the whole idea of giving the law in a wilderness is important because it's not given in the context of comfort. It's given in the context of transition, right? You might ask, well, why didn't God just give the law before they left Egypt? Just get everybody in a room and say, okay, we're going to leave Egypt and it's going to go like this. Or why didn't God wait until they were on the other side? Oh, yay, we're in the promised land. Now that you're in the promised land. Now we're going to give you the law. It doesn't happen that way. It happens in the most vulnerable place possible, right? Because God specializes in vulnerable places, right? But it's also to give them structure. They need it more in the vulnerable place, right? You know this if you've ever taken a vacation with your kids, a driving vacation. You've left home, you're going somewhere. In the middle, you're not home, you're not there, and everybody's hungry. What happens? That's when the fight breaks out. That's right. Everybody's hangry, right? You're impatient, right? That's liminality, right? That's Israelite. I mean, that's the story, right? So when you look at a time, Egypt, Sinai, the promised land, from what's known to what's Unknown, you're in transition. Right? So they're in this, the law helps to bring structure in that particular place so that they know what's happening, or they have a sense of who they are. The other thing that happens is you've got, I mean, this is a little bit of a picture, but if you put it on a timeline, you have liminality motion this way, but you've also got it spatially from the divine to the human, right? Pictured as a mountain. At the top of the mountain, Sinai, what's happening?
God meets Moses.
God meets Moses. And what happens up there?
Burns his commandments into the stones.
Yeah, but before that, what happens up on the, we're gonna get there. What happens on the top of the mountain? God's talking to Moses. God is super angry because of what's happening at the base, which is this big party. We're gonna talk about the party, not today, but later. Because it's actually not quite what we've been led to think that it is. But at any rate, you have Moses who gets the tablets of stone. And Exodus is very specific. Deuteronomy is not. Absolutely, Exodus is very specific, that the tablets were written by the finger of God. I mean, this is like this is divine writing into stone, right? Moses, the intercessor, has the literal writing of God in his hands. And you would think, at least one would hope, that if any one of us had that kind of a treasure, that nothing can happen to this, right? But Moses doesn't even make it down to the mountain before what happens?
Yeah.
He hears the sound of the party and the commandments are smashed. What does that tell you about this stage of divine writing? Where is it? What happens to it? It's over.
It's over.
No, well, this almost strikes me, and this is also a repeated theme throughout the Hebrew scriptures.
Mhm.
You know, Abraham does it. You know, it's God says, you know what, I'm gonna wipe all these people out, and I'm gonna give you some new people. And then Moses stands up to God,
Mhm.
you know.
Which is a big
which-
deal.
Which is a big deal, yeah. I mean, Abraham did it too. It's like, you know, he's gonna give away his wife rather than anger the king that
Mhm.
whose land he's entering. Well, yeah, you stand up to God, but not me,
Mhm.
mainly because you know God forgives much easier than man,
You would hope.
hopefully.
Hopefully.
Maybe not.
Yeah, but I mean, but
Maybe not.
then Moses kind of challenges him and says, well, what are all these other people gonna say? He couldn't take care of those people, so they all died. So, you know, he argues.
Yeah, it's that old, what will people think?
Yeah.
You know, well, the Egyptians think if you do this. But one of the things that happens is that we see the brittleness of law. Law's brittle, right? You've got the holiness of God coming into contact with almost the unruly nature of humanity, right? And this is a relationship that's volatile. Like you've said, we see it over and over in different ways. But it is a relationship nonetheless that has to be worked out. Hence, all the different perspectives you find in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, of how this is worked out, right? It's worked out over and over and over and over again, right? Yeah, Cale?
So is this commentary on the nature of law?
Mhm.
On, you can set rules, but then once it meets reality or once it meets people, what does Sabbath mean? What does the
Yeah,
law does not
Mhm.
hold up long-term?
it has to be mediated, right? So for example, this is the example of how this works. You're on the parkway, speed limit's 55 miles an hour, you're going 90. You get pulled over. You broke the law. right? The law was there, 55, don't go faster. But you're going 90 miles an hour because you've got somebody in the hospital that's about to die and you want to see them. Right? And so when the officer comes up, what do you hope happens? That he lets you go because he understands your story. Right? You want that story to be more powerful than the absoluteness of the law, right? Which can't really contain that story. You see how that works? And so there's always a conversation between law and story, which is what we're going to talk about next week, right? That you've got these commandments, but yet there are countless stories of what happens when you apply them, right? It gets more complicated than that. And so, you know, for me, this is what makes the Old Testament study so compelling because it's so human, right? When I went to seminary years and years ago, I did what I thought everybody was supposed to do, which was to enroll and take Greek and do New Testament and whatever. I went to my first class in Hebrew Bible and immediately changed my major and have never looked back. It was just more interesting, right? I mean, you had all this complexity of what it means to be human, right? And I noticed this, and I just have to say this. I know it's a little bit off topic, but I noticed this and have noticed it consistently in my New Testament professors when I was in seminary and my Old Testament professors. I noticed it in my colleagues even now. New Testament people are really, really good at logic. Old Testament people are really, really good at human nature. And it's because of the kind of material we have, right? If you try to apply logic, Western logic, to understanding Hebrew text, you're going to be eternally frustrated because they don't work that way, right? If you try to throw stories at Paul, it's going to be the opposite, right? He's going to argue you to death, right? You need both. Both are important, but both are in conversation. That has to happen. So, here's our takeaways for today. We're vulnerable in liminal spaces. I think that's a big takeaway from really studying the commandments, right? Is that we're vulnerable, we need structure. The law protects, guides, instructs, and teaches in these spaces. They help us understand how to be. At the same time, law is fragile and it's brittle in the face of our desire. But we have a responsibility to master this desire. It's not easy. There's no simple answer. God meets us in our vulnerable or liminal state with patience and with mercy. And the question really for us then is, how do we meet others in their vulnerable state? How do we keep each other? Right? Because that's ultimately the point for us. Right? How do we do that? So our time is right about up, but if there are just a couple of questions, or I think we may have time for one or two.
To address like for the first statement, why so many do nots, because it's a lot easier to tell you, it's a lot easier to set the boundary as to what not to do. You know, it's like, you know, instead, it's easier to say, do not kill, rather than to say, you know, don't beat each other up, don't do this, don't do that, you know, or you can do this, but not that. And it would be like, it would be a book all of itself on each of the commandments to explain them. It's much easier to say, do not covet. You know what it means to covet.
You know where the line is.
You know, yeah, you know what it means to covet. You know what it means to bear false witness. You know what it means to dishonor your mother and father. So these are much more easily understood than to try to explain it and cover all the potential parameters.
Thank you. Yeah.
I see parallels here, like with the tax law. The tax laws in each country are this thick about all the things you shall not, the tax. Whereas Christ says, pay your due to the government. And the same thing, law versus Christ saying, love your neighbour. The complexity of do nots versus the simplicity of do.
Of dues. Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, Al?
That last point there, how do we meet others in their vulnerable state? Love.
Love, yes.
I mean, we haven't talked about love at all today. But isn't that kind of what God's trying to tell us with all of these rules?
Well, it's God's love for us to give us,
Which
The
we in
rules.
turn should
we should impart
each
to
other.
others, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that made me think of, how Jesus had the adulterous woman, she's involved.
Yeah,
It makes me think of that.
that's good. Yes, sir.
But again, the last point, I love the idea how you sort of turned it where your focus now is on us, not so much on the law, right? We tend to focus too much on the law. I love your example about the speed limit, right? Speed limit in my neighborhood, 25 miles per hour. No one goes 25. And if everyone goes 40, well, then we started saying, you know what, that law is stupid. It should be 40 should be the speed limit. And then, it's easy to start changing a lot of our own desires. You're focusing it back on us. It's our adherence to the law that we need to help others with, not focusing on, well, how do we change the law to better suit us?
Right, yeah. Yeah, Scott?
It's really, it never really hit me until today. The wandering in the wilderness was years and years and years and years in a liminal space.
Mhm.
And God was present with them. I would say how we help each other people in a vulnerable state is to ask for help when we're in a vulnerable state. I mean, it's a reciprocal thing. Israel was all together in a liminal space. And we are too. I mean, we
That's right, we
all
are.
are in these spaces on a regular basis. And are we asking for help and are we giving help? That's
Yes, right. And the way, just to pick up both of these, I don't want to leave without talking about this, is to recognize in that story of Cain and Abel, I actually think that the way that story has typically for years been titled, the story of Cain and Abel, is actually not right. It's the story of Cain and God. Because the conversation all the way through is with Cain. God has the compassion for Cain to talk about Cain, who is upset over what's happened. Right. And so God meets Cain in Cain's own vulnerability, which I think is amazing, right? God does not say to Abel, "Oh, good job, you do it." I mean, that's not where the conversation is. The conversation is with the vulnerable one. Okay, we'll have more to say about this next week, but who has